one of the things that we do is incubate healthcare startups. We work with a little more than 200 of them. We have a suite of services to help them. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to go into that in more detail, or any of the other things that we do. But for the moment, I'll leave it at that. A little bit of my background coming out of Kellogg. I went to work for Abbott Labs for about 10 years in a variety of different functions. I then went and joined Pritzker Group, which was two members of the Pritzker family with about $8 million. And it was an investment entity. It got complicated because one of them is now the governor, and there were a bunch of changes. But I left about about 6 years ago, almost 6 years ago, to start Matter, and have been running that ever since. Donna Edelson, I got to know as we were putting Matter together. She had started a company called QuantHC, and I will let her go into all the details about what it does, but she had started this company, which I found to be really quite fascinating, and so got to know her a little bit, and she's been a member of Matter since the day we opened our doors, and merged with another company called Agile MD, which again she'll go into there, and is well on the path to creating a company that can really affect significant change across the healthcare ecosystem. She is a practicing physician that has practiced at University of Chicago for a number of years. She's really become an expert in all-cause decompensation, is very well published in that realm, and essentially was able to take her learnings and convert them into a company that does miraculous things. And again, we'll get to that in a moment. Her company, it's an analytics company, and the topic tonight is analytics and how analytics is changing and shaping healthcare. There are a few very macro level, high level trends that are affecting, driving change in healthcare. And one of the biggest of those is the availability of data. Healthcare clinical data until relatively recently was largely stored in paper file folders. And that makes it very hard to analyze, very hard to do any kind of sophisticated analytics. And over the last decade-ish, we've really seen near universal adoption of electronic medical records and really the penetration of these systems across the healthcare ecosystem. And that has fostered what I think is the most interesting area of healthcare innovation. It's the ability to collect data from people in some way or another, analyze it, develop a set of algorithms or analytics, and then create insights that wouldn't otherwise be available to you or I or any healthcare professional who might be with an individual. And I don't think there's a better example of that trend and that phenomenon than Agile MD. So with that, Donna, without going into too much detail, but describe what your company does.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here, and Stephen for the setup. So in short, we are a clinical decision support engine that marries predictive analytics with a clinical workflow. So with clinical pathways that are embedded inside the EHR. So we take them from the analytic to actually get them to do the intervention that ultimately is what we believe is going to make a difference in the patient's life. And we deploy it in their workflow where they are inside the EHR.
So maybe talk a little bit about how you, the research that went into starting the company, and what kind of the foundation is that you based it on.
Sure. So I was working at the University of Chicago. I'm a clinical hospitalist, which means I take care of patients that are sick enough to be admitted to the hospital. And I've always been particularly interested in patients around transition, so transitions from the ER to the inpatient arena, from the general ward to the ICU, and those the I was initially actually doing research around cardiac arrest in the hospital, and noticed, and this was pre electronic health records, and noticed that a lot of the patients that we were studying, and we were doing really cool work with accelerometers trying to figure out how deep and how fast to push. And anyone who's read, if you follow any of the guidelines in CPR, you'll see my name all over them. That's really where I got started. But in terms, it became clear that a lot of the patients who were resting in the hospital had evidence of clinical deterioration in the hours, if not days, leading up to it. And that was all around the time that we were switching over to an electronic health record. So University of Chicago switched to having an EMR in 2008. And so it was just a really good time. I was in the right place at the right time to start pulling that data and starting to try to figure out, okay, well, can we actually pick up that signal in the data? And this is all around the same time that machine learning analytics were actually really taking off. And so we're finding new techniques that didn't even exist before. So the stats are getting more sophisticated at the same time that more data is becoming available. And it was just a really exciting time to be building predictive analytics around that. And particularly in this area, where I was already so focused, which was how do I treat these patients who are going to have a cardiac arrest even before they have it? Because once they arrest, 75% of them are going to die. If I can get them before, 75% of them are going to live.
So there's an example that for me crystallizes perfectly the promise of your company, and in many ways I think captures the potential of analytics in general to really improve healthcare. There was a hospital in, I think it was in the western suburbs, that was piloting your solution, and they had some just really tremendous success. Can you share that story?
I can, although I have to give you props on this one, Stephen, because we actually only knew about this customer. This was our first paying customer, which we actually only knew about because we were incubated at Matter, and there was an RFA that came through Matter, and we're like, all right, we'll apply for this. And a bunch of startups came in. So at that point, we were only running our analytic at the University of Chicago, which was where I was working. And so this was the first external customer. And so we went through this whole process. They started with a bunch of applicants, got it down to 16 that they had come present, and then they picked ultimately 2 to turn on live. And so we turned it on, and within, I can't remember if it was a week or 2 weeks, they had their first save. And I will say that every hospital that we go live in, we wait for that first save, and it's invariably within the first 2 weeks. And that's a really critical save, because that's the one that you publicize and you get everybody all totally bought in. For that one hospital, it was a postpartum patient. Otherwise had been totally healthy, in her 20s, woman who had delivered her first baby and was on a postpartum unit, which for any of you who've been on a postpartum unit, there's not a lot of healthcare that goes on over there. That generally people are pretty healthy, and they're just bringing the baby by and letting you sleep. And so the algorithm was running in the whole hospital, and it flashed red on this one patient, and so an alert went to the rapid response team, which was a team of critical care nurses who were proactively monitoring these patients. And they actually probably thought initially it was an error, because it's so unusual for anybody to actually be ill on a postpartum unit. So they went over to go see the patient, and they gathered a bunch of vital signs, and they put a pulse oximeter on her finger to try to figure out what her oxygen saturation was reading, and they couldn't get it to pick up at all. And so again, they thought maybe there was something wrong with the device. Ultimately, they sent a blood gas. She was profoundly hypoxic, so her oxygen saturation was very, very low, to the point where that low level was probably could have lasted maybe another 20 minutes to a half an hour at that level before she would have had a cardiac arrest. uh, and they would have had no idea. That would have easily been a cardiac arrest. They get her on oxygen. They get her over to the ICU. Chest X-ray is full of fluid, and it turns out she had a postpartum cardiomyopathy, so heart failure. It's rare, but it happens, and it's one of the ways that women can die in the postpartum era. And it was huge and galvanizing. And that woman ended up getting a new heart valve, went home with her baby a week later, and is totally fine. And we have, I will say, there's not a single hospital we've gone live in that we don't have a great story. That's, everybody loves a postpartum save, but that's.
Yeah, I get chills every time I hear that story. And it, can you describe a little bit more, because I think this audience is interested in tech and the inner workings of it. So you in this particular situation, you don't have a pulse oximeter on, so you're not measuring her blood oxygen levels. What triggers an alert in a situation like this? How does the system know? Like, what is the system ingesting? And how is it going through this analytic process to come to the conclusion that this woman that nobody noticed that she was, in a very critical situation? I don't know if she noticed she was in a critical situation or not, but how did it know?
Yeah. So that's what's so interesting about machine learning analytics in general, is that they're unlike the default, which is, I think, current the default in healthcare is to you have a checklist that says we would call single parameter activation criteria, which would say if your blood pressure falls below this number, or your heart rate rises above this number, or your oxygen saturation drops below this number, then activate the rapid response team and call for help, or call the physician. If that's, in fact, that was classic as a med student. We still, if anybody has a healthcare background, it's part of the admission orders that we traditionally write. There's an if then, if this happens, call for help. And they're all single parameter. If you meet any of these thresholds, call for help. The problem with single parameter activation criteria, they make sense. It's how we think. And they're easy for us as humans to effectuate. The problem is that if you need to activate based on any one of those thresholds, they have to be pretty profoundly deranged. So your heart rate has to be 130, right? Your oxygen saturation has to be below 90 before we'll activate. Otherwise, you'll be activating all the time. Whereas this, when you're talking about these machine learning analytics where we're pulling the newest version of this model runs on 100 variables. So if a few of them are off by a little bit and they're interacting in just the right way, you'll pick it up without any single one being so profoundly off. When if someone's heart rate is 130, it's pretty obvious and everyone sees it.
And so in this case, it was, is it a black box? Is it so it's not rules based in the way that if X is over 130,
Right.
then trigger an alarm? Is it a black box that's just learning over time, or what is the underlying technology?
So we don't. So yeah, and that is the downside of these algorithms, is that they're technically black boxes. I can't, unlike even the logistic regression models where I can write them out on, put them on an Excel sheet and someone can calculate them. This is the analytic is actually a black box, but that's one of the things that we're working on now. And so I actually have grants in to do this, to try to figure out how to make them more interpretable, because actually people have a hard time following completely black box algorithms. So they may actually default to want to go with a simpler, less accurate model that they can understand than one that's totally black box. And so there are some really cool things that you can do with machine learning that, again, didn't exist before. But we can do things like show you that the weights of the different variables, and they change from one moment at a time. So, but I can do, we can do what we call a variable importance plot. So I know I may not be able to give you you can't calculate it yourself, even with a calculator, but I can tell you that the respiratory rate is the most important variable, and the heart rate is 70% as important as the respiratory rate. And so you start to feel a little bit better about it. And now in this, there are now some really cool, really new techniques that nobody's using, that I hope to actually have live. We have a grant to do this in the next 6 months to a year, where we'll actually be able to show you the weight change from one point to the next. And this is where this is now going to go beyond into the full-on geek mode of the machine learning. So I'll go there if you want me to, but feel free to pull me back into the world of the entrepreneur. It's very cool though.
Well, let's talk about the fact that you can go there for a second, because you're a physician, and you practice medicine, and you're publishing papers on cardiac mortality and all-cause decompensation and things like that, and you've got a great career as a physician and a researcher, and somehow you went from that to well, first of all, running a startup, but also like you're kind of a data scientist now. And I don't know if there's not necessarily a traditional path for an entrepreneur to build a company, but if there was, you wouldn't be it. So how did you get to this point? How did you end up as a startup CEO, and then a co-founder of a larger entity after the merger? And how did you end up as effectively a data scientist, and knowing everything that you know about these kinds of analytics?
Well, so the transition into a startup, that I did kicking and screaming. That was not what I wanted to do. That it just did not feel safe. I didn't like any part of it. It felt real safe staying in academia, writing papers and grants. I knew how to do that. I understood how to climb the ranks there. And when I first said, I think I need to do this, and the reason I actually felt like I needed to do it is because so yes, I am a data scientist, but honestly, what I really am at core is a quality improvement person. That's like in the hospital, I see myself as somebody who wants to change the way, to change behavior and to get people to do the right thing to take care of these patients. So if that tool is research, for me was just a means to an end. It was how I got my time paid for at the hospital. I wrote grants so that I could pay for the work that I wanted to do, so that people would leave me alone and not force me to take care of patients 24/7, because that is incredibly unforgiving. But my love was always in QI. The data science was also just a means to an end. How do we do this better? Because the algorithms, when they have too many false alarms, people can't tolerate them and they ignore them. And so it was always just, how do we do this a little bit? I'm a tweaker. I fix it. I need it to work well. And so I'll do what I need to do to get that. And that's essentially what happened with the company. I was like, okay, well, we did this. Now we have something that actually works, that saves patient lives, and nobody knows about it except for the few people who read my papers, and none of those people have the ability to implement. And so it was there where I said, okay, well, the easiest, the way I'm going to do this is actually I'm going to have to turn it into a commercial product, and this is how we're going to disseminate this work. And I was right, it's much faster, but I also was falsely reassured that I didn't really think I was going to have to do too much of this. I created the company, I licensed the IP from the university in tech transfer, and then I very quickly thereafter signed partnerships with big companies who wanted to license the IP, and who were gonna actually do the commercial part that I didn't want to do. But it turns out that doesn't work. And so ultimately I had to build it myself. I tried multiple times, as hard as I could, to avoid having to build my own platform, and also to avoid doing my own sales. And there was no way around that.
So there's been well, actually, Isabel, what was your aversion to becoming a startup CEO to begin with? What was the why weren't you like, yes, I get to take this and build a company and this is super exciting?
So if you asked me at the time, I was 100% certain that the reason was because I was afraid to fail. That I had never failed at anything. And I thought, this is the first thing I've ever done in my whole entire life that I could actually fail at. Now, if you ask my therapist will say it was actually because I was afraid to succeed, which is, uh,
It's be an
so
interesting conversation.
it is a very interesting conversation. But it was definitely fear-based. I'll leave it at that. It was one of those two.
One of those two. So there have been a number of inflection points along the path of your journey, and it sounds like obviously you described a couple of them. One was kicking and screaming into creating something because you weren't able to affect the kind of change beyond the walls of U of C and the handful of people who'd read your paper, and then you thought you could have this model where it was more of a licensing arrangement, and that didn't work. And so there have been a number of those kinds of key inflection points, those key decisions. Talk about what that journey's been like.
So I think I hit on a few of those. So then I licensed the IP. I realize I'm going to have to do some of this building myself. But I met my now business partner who had come out of Booth. So he's at Booth. I'm in the medical school at University of Chicago, and we met. He actually showed up. I was wearing my hat in my administrative role as the executive medical director for inpatient quality and safety. I was sitting in a meeting where vendors were coming through to present their technology, and I was trying to decide if we wanted any of this technology. And he showed up to do one of these presentations on the same day that we had we had built the homegrown version of, so eCard is our analytic, and had gotten it running at the university on what I call now the popsicle stick and masking tape version, homegrown version. And so, but it was working. We were running it in real time in the hospital on a platform that was usable. And Borna showed up with his platform, and he had this clinical decision support pathway that was totally integrated in the EHR. Ours was not. It was a standalone, but it would run in real time. He had this platform that was EHR based with clinical pathways, and you could effectuate orders, basically. Everything that we have been doing on paper in PDFs, where we draw these algorithms and teach people how to do stuff, and all of our textbooks are filled with them, he had figured out a way to embed it inside the EHR so that you could actually follow a decision tree and intervene and order right from there. And I thought, wow, what he's showing us right now isn't going to work by itself, because there was no way for people to know they needed to go use to get to a pathway. Whereas what I had was an algorithm that could tell you that it was time to do something, but didn't actually help you do this. And it was real. And I'm sitting there right there, and I'm thinking, all right, my chocolate, your peanut butter, this is totally going to work. And I knew it. I knew it sitting there in that moment that we were going to be able to put this together. And so for the next probably year or so, we worked together. We didn't merge the companies. We tried out a couple of our customers. So customers that he had that were pathway customers, we added the analytic to, and we built out the whole interface, and we did the same with mine, and it worked amazingly well. And then suddenly we were able to have outcomes results too. So I can tell you that and this is where I was going to come back to the whole where analytics is today. And I think there's real upsides, and then there's some real safety things, some real places where I think we need to be careful about the promise of analytics. Analytics are amazing, but an analytic by itself is never going to save a patient's life. you have to figure out how to put it in their workflow and get providers to actually use it. And it has to be easier for them to use it. They have to like it. They have to trust it. Otherwise, it's honestly, all you're doing is creating risk for the lawyers afterwards. And so we were able to show, for example, that when we just had the analytic on a standalone platform, really pretty in the way that where you could see it on dashboard, but we didn't actually push to a workflow. We could bring mortality down from in septic patients. We could bring mortality down from, say, 13 and change percent down to 12 and change percent. Like that's real, and that's a lot of lives saved. But when we put it together with the clinical pathways and we drove the providers to actually intervene, order antibiotics, order lactate, do all the things that we know actually saves the patients, that's when we saw the mortality come way down. And so we could bring their mortality down by 36% with the combined benefit. And that's huge. That meant at that point now we're able to show that for every 21 patients that we monitored with this system, we could save one life. And that's putting it all together. And so at this point, I started working in this space. It was 2008, right? So we're talking about 12 years, almost 13 years now in this space. And today, everybody and their mother has some AI analytic that they're excited. They got a data set, they're building an AI tool, and they're so excited. And you're like, an algorithm is just an algorithm. It's pretty cheap. The key is, one, how good is your algorithm? So it needs to be a really good algorithm, because anybody can just run one of these in a program and spit something out. But separate from that, it has to also work in the workflow, and it really, really has to drive people to do something. And I'll say even that isn't enough. You also then need a whole package around reporting, benchmarking, dashboarding, and all of that stuff and training people how to do QI. And that's where I actually got back to my roots, which ultimately was what I loved to do, which is getting people which was doing the change management. So I finally had all the tools that I needed. And so where I was working before as the executive medical director for inpatient quality and safety at one hospital, I now have 80 hospitals that I'm running these tools in, and where I'm actually doing this job, which is figuring out what their problem is, giving them the tools they need, and then coaching them up to actually get the people on the front lines to do the right stuff.
I have about 20 questions about the entrepreneurial journey, but I'll save those for now. But if anybody's interested, and for those of you who didn't hear at the front when Nikki introduced the forum, there's something called Slido that they're using to collect questions. So if you have any questions, we'll turn it to those audience questions in a couple of minutes. We can't really have a discussion probably about any topic right now, but certainly about anything related to healthcare and not talk about coronavirus. So, we at Matter we're very close to a number of health systems and have, been talking to them basically continuously. And this pandemic has really upended decision-making within a lot of hospitals and changed the timing and the process. It has dramatically accelerated the deployment of certain categories of technologies that were maybe, viewed as nice to have or just sort of, weren't part of a critical path, must implement as soon as possible. How has all of this affected your business?
Yeah, I think we're still trying to figure out exactly how it's affecting the business. It's as you noted, the timelines completely changed. Things that used to be our sales cycle was a year before. We're doing things now in a week. We're deploying, the decisions getting made, and then we're turning things on live. We had a 40 hospital health system that made a decision on a Monday to purchase. They were done with contracting and security review by Friday. This is unheard of.
Astonishing.
Astonishing. And they were live, and we had it built and live the following Monday.
Uh,
So a week from
Yeah.
decision to deployed in 40 hospitals. It's insane. So yeah, so we cut through an incredible amount of bureaucracy, and it's not just them, it's the government too. I just did the same thing with the VA. The VA just cut through all of the bureaucracy and is turning on live in a government hospital in a few weeks. It's incredible. And we could have done this before. I think healthcare, we're so slow. So we were overly cautious and way too slow. I think this is incredible. But that was also, I think we're now starting to see all the cuts. So everybody now is scaling back, and they're losing IT in particular. So that's really difficult, because on the one hand, we're giving them tools that will makes their lives easier once we're deployed, but we still need IT people to be able to deploy. We've had to figure out how to deploy our tool, do it all remotely. So we used to go on site and do a whole bunch of things on site. Everything now gets done remotely. So we can deploy our tool in 2-3 hour blocks of time with an IT analyst remotely without ever touching their computers. That's helpful. Yeah, it's in general, doing sales remotely is harder, but you get the benefit of it. I don't know. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. Initially, people were terrified and had no idea what to do, and so they were grabbing things, and now I think everyone's relaxing a little bit. They're still scared, but they're not terrified in the same way that they were. But now they're trying to figure out what their new normal is going to be with all of the loss in revenue. And so now we're starting to see people come back and say, yes, we definitely need this. We're worried about finances. And so I think we'll probably have some more creative financing and probably be looking more at charging based on cost savings as opposed to fixed pricing. We also are giving things away for free. So some of the stuff that's specifically related to COVID, we decided to offer for free for a year. And a lot of hospitals took us up on that. And that's been something that historically we didn't want to do before. But so far it looks like they're taking it, they're falling in love with it for COVID. And then they're turning around and asking, well, what about the rest of our tools?
That's great. Yeah, so it sounds like everything related to this pandemic, it's a fluid situation, and we'll see how it plays out. As an aside, for anybody who's watching who is thinking about starting a company that is selling into health systems, a 12-month sales cycle is entirely normal. 12 to 18 months is what we see all the time. And that isn't to deployment, that's to getting a signature on a contract. Then there's a security audit and a bunch of other things that can easily take months. And then there's getting on the calendar to actually have the implementation. And it's a mind-numbing, very long process. So just as a word of caution, be prepared for that if this is a path that you're going down. And hopefully there's something that health systems, we've talked to a number of health systems who said, I hope we can retain some of this decision-making speed and some of this acceleration. They're not optimistic, but they've exercised different muscles and learned different things along the way. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. So Angela, I know we have a number of questions from the audience. I will turn it to you to moderate those questions.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much for sharing. You've had such an interesting journey. So I wanted to share some of the questions that we've collected from the audience. And the first one here is kind of about the changing healthcare landscape. So how does Agile MD think about the shift to value-based care models? And how does the product help address the challenges in implementing value-based care?
Yeah, so the one of the biggest savings that we find in here is that we decrease length of stay. When you pick up these patients earlier and you intervene earlier, you bring the length of stay down. And so because of that, there's actually real significant cost savings associated with that. Now, I'm trying to figure out, I'm not sure we've totally worked it into our model. And also just even in terms of pricing, at this point, we're still trying to create a market for something that people don't even know they necessarily need yet. They're coming around to it, but a lot of hospitals still, when you talk to them about predictive analytics, and they're like, yeah, that's amazing. That's 10 years from now. They're not under, and so at this point, I think we're way underpricing. We know we're way underpricing when we're selling stuff, and we're still generating the data. But so far, the early data looks like we bring length of stay down in a lot of these patient groups by as much as a day, which is pretty significant cost savings. And so the expectation is that we'll that we should work really well in a setup like that.
Awesome.
And
Another
can I
question.
add one other comment on that? We see from our vantage point two really great important drivers of innovation in healthcare. One we talked about, which is the availability of data and the ability to do something with it. The other one is this transition to value-based care. And that transition, while it is slow and kludgy and has a lot of challenges, it has the potential, as it accelerates, to create an incredible demand for technologies like this and like all sorts of solutions that can really improve health in ways that this doesn't really apply to Agile MD, but solutions that don't necessarily have an obvious business model in a fee-for-service environment, that in a value-based care environment have a very clear business model.
Thanks for sharing. Another question we got, it's kind of related to what you were saying earlier, Dama, about how analytics alone doesn't help save lives. So what design principles do you use to make sure you're really building a product that enhances the clinician experience and doesn't add to their administrative burden?
Yeah, well, I think this is one of the places where it benefits that I am a clinician and that I built a tool I wanted to use, and I'm routinely designing it to be what I want. Now, I'm not great about, I probably fall more towards the Apple take on this, which is I'm often not that interested in what other people tell me they want, and I'm much more interested in what I actually what I want. Design principles, I believe, like you should never click there. You should never have any extra clicks. If you can do it in one click, why should you? There shouldn't be four. Stuff has to be pretty. That really matters to me. And you have to give people the data without overwhelming them. And so that's one of the things where I personally, my business partner will laugh all the time because whenever I'm driving in the car, I've got multiple GPS tools up and running. Like I'll have Apple Maps and I'll have the Apple one, and I'll have Waze on at the same time. And before Waze was Google, I would have that too. And I'd look at all of them, and and sometimes I won't follow any of them. I'll take them all under advisement, and then I'll make the left that I want to make because I'm looking and I see that I'm, that I can get there without that red. And my colleagues will always laugh at me and be like, "What are you doing?" I said, he's like, you're an analytics person, and you know that if you generally follow these AI algorithms, if you follow them, they'll get you there faster. And I'm like, that's true. That on average, if I always followed Waze every single time I got in the car, on average, I would spend less time getting to places than I would if I just went with my own intuition every time. But that doesn't mean that on any individual ride, I can't outperform Waze. And so in general, I do follow them, but sometimes you do something different. And that's my view when it comes to predictive analytics in the hospital too. I will never blindly follow an analytic, even my own. I would never expect anybody that uses my tools to follow them blindly. All I'm doing is calculating the predicted probability of a deterioration, and I'm trying to help them prioritize which patient to go see next. When they get there, they have to decide, is this patient actually sick or not, and what am I going to do next? And so I need to give them enough information that they can see that, and then that they can add to it, and without overwhelming them with so much data. And I cannot have false alarms. If we do all the work that we do without sending alerts inside the EHR, we joke that we're BPA free inside the EHR. So that's I'm trying to think what else. But I will say, in fairness, I don't actually have a design background. I don't have an engineering background. I'm just a user who likes pretty things that are really efficient.
It's really interesting. And talking about Agile MD solutions, we have another question about how adaptable are Agile MD solutions across various care settings, including hospital versus outpatient, different specialties, and different EMR systems?
That's a great question. And so we're EHR based. So we work in the ambulatory setting and in the inpatient setting and in the ED, as long as you're inside the EHR. We have tools. You can use our tools as standalone, but as I've shown, that's sort of like the Prius version. If you want to use our tools the way they were meant to be used, you really want to, it needs to be something EHR based, a workflow that's in the EHR. In terms, the EHRs we work really well with are Cerner and Epic, because they have all the functionality to allow us to do a full two-way integration with orders. But we can work with any EHR. A one-way integration is we can do with anything, but some of the older EHRs just don't allow the two-way integration.
Cool. We're also getting a lot of questions around, for those of us who are hoping to go into data science or get a better understanding of machine learning, do you have any advice for us hoping to ramp up on those topics? How did you do it, and what kind of advice would you have for us?
Well, it was changing so fast that so at this point, I think there's real value to having in studying it in some formal way. And I'll say that in fairness, at this point now, I don't actually do my own analytics anymore. It's at this point now outpaced me such that I have the original versions of the model I coded myself. Other people now on my team code faster than I can and keep up with it in a way that I don't. I'm spending more of my time now doing sales and success. My collaborator on the research side is a PhD data scientist. If you have to decide though what you want to do. Do you want to be the person who's actually coding it? If so, you need to learn how to do it, and you need to keep up with it, because it's literally changing every 6 months. There's something new that we didn't know you could do before. Or do you want to be knowledgeable enough that you're dangerous? Like, that's me, right? I keep up enough to be able to speak to it and understand what's going on, and to ask for what I want without doing the coding at this point. And that you can probably do that without a degree. I have a master's degree that's been helpful. Or do you want to be even one step more removed, where again you can speak to it, but you're not going to dig in there and really get into the real the real complicated piece of it. Be honest about who you are and what you actually see yourself doing, and then align yourself with that with people who are actually doing what you want to be doing. and make sure that you partner with people who are going to do the other piece, because like I said, you could put your head down and get buried into building analytics. That isn't, you need to partner though with people who understand the data that's coming in, to know what's usable data and how people are going to use it. And there's so many places that you can be, or also then figuring out how you're going to implement it, and how you get other people to use it and understand it, and how you build the pathways around it. There's so many places you could be. Just be honest about which piece you're going to do, and recognize that there's no chance you can do it all.
That's really helpful. Related to advice that either you or Stephen might have for us, people are wondering, how should MBAs specifically be adopting this evolving health tech landscape?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think people are just wondering about how can MBAs position ourselves to be especially strong as we recruit for positions or try to learn more about the health tech landscape.
Wait, that's hard, because that's like saying, like, how do MDs position themselves? Like, it's a really broad thing. Again, it goes to what do you want to be? What do you want to be doing? And maybe Stephen's better equipped to answer this question. I think that the degree, an MBA is super helpful. Again, if you're going to partner yourself with the people who, if you're going to partner yourself with people who are actually going to do the coding, or you're going to learn, but you can still do the coding, or you're going to partner yourself with people who are the content expert if you're not the content expert, or you're going to partner yourself with people who are on the success side if that isn't your piece. These are all pieces that are really helpful to have, but it's all going to be a team sport. So figure out who you like working with and who fills in the gaps that you lack. I've seen MBAs who have different pieces of it, and just like I've seen MDs who have some components but not necessarily. And I'm not sure that the degree by itself guarantees you any specific niche.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, essentially, an MBA. So I happen to think that being in healthcare and entrepreneurship and innovation and technology is like the best place to be for lots of reasons. The people who tend to be most successful at starting companies and growing those tend to be people who have some healthcare DNA, some healthcare knowledge. And that can be because, like Donna, they're a physician. That can be because somebody worked in a healthcare environment for some period of time. It can be because people grew up in a healthcare family and everybody's doctors, or they just sort of learned a lot through osmosis. People who start companies from purely a tech or a purely a business point of view in healthcare often have a really hard time adapting to the rhythms and challenges of healthcare in particular. So I would say if you are coming from, if you don't have a healthcare background and you're looking to start a company in healthcare, it is really important to pair up with somebody who understands healthcare. If you're looking to join and I would recommend joining something first and getting some healthcare experience, whether it's a big company or a hospital or a startup, to get some a couple years of understanding of just how it works, because it doesn't work like other industries. It's the way that money flows, the way decisions get made, the regulatory overlays. It's a very complicated, sort of unique animal. And it's important that within any founding team, there is a healthy dose of that DNA, understanding how it works, in order to really be successful, in order to get funded. If you're trying to get venture backing and you're 3 MBAs with no healthcare background, it is it's not impossible, it happens, but it is much harder to get funded than if you have somebody on the founding team who really understands how healthcare works.
Mhm. That's really helpful. So we have just one more question here before I'll just hand it off to Nikki for some closing words, but would love to hear from both of you. We've touched on this a little bit, but looking forward, what do you think will determine the success of health tech startups post-COVID?
Donna, you want to start?
Probably thought about this one more than I have. So I will say that I think I can only speak to the space where I live, which is the tech part, and I think I think we need to understand the landscape of where we're going. It's all going to be, it's a projection, right? Because it's whatever I think I'm doing. So Steven's actually, I'm actually really interested to hear what he's going to say. I will say that that I think people tend to be reactive, and I think we need to understand where we're going. So in the predictive analytics is very cool. I actually think that we should be thinking about the continuum similar to the way we think about driverless cars right now. Today we're really fairly early on in the predictive analytics space. And everyone's thinking, okay, I'm going to build a tool. I'm going to take this data set and I'm going to have a tool that predicts something. And I'm saying, yeah, I actually think that's pretty reactive. We were doing that a decade ago. So we have today really smart analytics, but that are driving relatively dumb clinical pathways. The clinical pathways today are expert opinion driven in the same way that our analytics used to be expert opinion driven a decade ago. I think the next stage that we're working on is how do we use big data to help us figure out what we should be doing. So there's predicting who needs something, which is much easier than predicting what the correct next intervention is. And I think actually that's where we're living now. That's going to be a whole world of hurt, because now FDA is going to get really involved in that, because we're going to be recommending treatments. And so there is going to be a whole world of pain around that. But if we actually can solve that, that's going to be really important. Ultimately, though, I think from there, it's going to be a lot like driverless cars. Why then, if I know that this patient is septic and that they need, and I know, for example, that if it's you need 22 cc's per kilogram of body weight, but when Steven is septic, he actually needs 30 cc's per kg of IV fluids and a different antibiotic. So I can recommend that, and I'll know that from the data. But ultimately, why not just send that message directly, program it, and have that message go directly to the IV pump and give it to them? Why do I need to wait on a human to trip over it and forget or get stuck and not give it to them? So I think that the next 10 years, healthcare is going to look a lot like the driverless cars are, and it's going to be safer long term. And so we should be planning for that, but that's going to be really hard, and healthcare as a field is going to go kicking and screaming to it. But I think the ones that are successful are the ones that see that now and are planning for that today.
I think this crisis creates really an incredible opportunity for health tech startups. And I mean, I feel a little bad saying that. I don't mean to be cavalier about it, but every health system that we're talking to has, as we talked about before, rapidly deployed technologies that have become critical path, must-have solutions, and have the value of healthcare innovation and the value of digital health has increased dramatically in the minds of senior leaders and senior executives of every health system that we've touched. Every life sciences company we work with, it's exactly the same thing. They're all trying to figure out reinvent sales and marketing and clinical drug development, and everything that they have done and grown up with through the ranks involving person-to-person interactions. They're planning for some foreseeable future to not really have those kinds of interactions, and they're turning to digital health solutions to help them figure out how to do it. And across the board, there's been a tremendous amount of capital poured into digital health over the last 10 years. There's been a tremendous amount of entrepreneurship. It is by no means a mature industry. There are a gazillion startups. There's no sort of, I challenge anyone to think of like, who's the giant behemoth of digital health? There is no Google of digital health, and maybe it'll be Google at some point, but it's not today. There is no Apple of these things don't exist yet. And there is just a huge opportunity. The specifics of your question were, which ones are going to succeed? So first and foremost, it's going to be ones that don't run out of money. And, there are some companies, and Donna's, it sounds like it's one where they are front and center providing a tool that is valuable right now. And those companies are growing exponentially. Most healthcare technology startups are not, their solution isn't necessarily like must have in this acute phase of this crisis. And therefore everything's kind of slowed down for them. And so they need to make decisions about, how do we make sure we stay alive long enough to kind of weather this and ride the wave afterwards that's going to come. And then I would say, really thinking about whether the, are the things that 3 months ago somebody was willing to pay you to accomplish, 6 months from now, are those going to be exactly the same things in the sort of we're not going to be post-COVID by then, but in a post this phase of COVID by then, is it going to be the same things that need to be done, or is it going to be something different? And there isn't an answer to that because this is such an unprecedented situation for everybody, but being able to be nimble, to be very close and hyper responsive to insights from the market, and being able to be a partner to customers through this journey that they're all going on, that they don't really know what they're doing, because again, nobody knows what they're doing in this situation. Those are the companies that I think will have the greatest chance of really flourishing as we come out of the acute phase of this crisis and move into whatever that next phase looks like, and then the phase beyond, when we're hopefully this whole thing at some point is in the rearview mirror.
Ethan and Donna, I think that this has been a really great hour. Thank you so much for joining us. I think we don't always get to engage with technology topics that actually are saving lives, and so taking the time. For those of you on the call, just also wanted to plug that we still have 2 more scheduled events in the Spring Speaker Series. On the 20th of May, we have What's Next in Autonomous Mobility with Erica Linford, who is the VP of Commercial Development. And then on the 28th of May, we have Cameron James, who's the VP of Physical Stores with Amazon, in a moderated fireside chat with Professor Cass. So thanks so much for staying on a couple minutes, and I hope everybody has a good rest of their evening. Thanks
so
everybody.
much.
Bye.
Thank you.